All right, so hey guys, I'm back at the Fed. I'm going around the block to see if I can maybe get in the back door and see what's going on, because I'd like to get some information on the Phillips curve, right, which is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. What we're saying is, as unemployment is falling, inflation is rising. Something we might be willing to say is happening right now in this country. Right? The unemployment rate's been coming down, inflation's been a little high. All right, so it's a graphical representation of the trade-off. Let's look at some numbers here, right? So here we have our U.S. employment and inflation. Inflation is in blue, unemployment is in red, and you can see somewhat that one's going up, one's going down. It's not perfect, right? I wouldn't say it happens every time, but for the most part, you can definitely see that relationship. So what we would do is we would graph this. X and Y axis, unemployment rate on the X, inflation rate on the Y. Remember, it's unemployment rate. Okay, so it's unemployment, not employment. We do a downward sloping short run Phillips curve. All right. Okay, so that's what it would look like. When I put a 4 there, that's going to end up being 4%. But let's break it down and look at it with the long run aggregate supply model, right? So here I have a long run aggregate supply where the economy is in a recession, right? The quantity is lower than full employment. All right, so if I mark that point where they intersect and then mark it on the short run Phillips curve, all right? That point A on the short run Phillips curve is the inflation rate and the unemployment rate based on this model. Now, let's have a scenario. Consumers and business confidence falls. This causes the aggregate demand to decrease, shown by a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So we have this happening, right? When this happens, we end up with a new point, which is point B. If you notice, output is lower, which means employment is lower and unemployment is higher. But price level is falling. So we have to show that on the short run Phillips curve, and we do that by picking a point to the right of A. Okay, so from the original spot of A, we're moving down the curve to B. So let's just look at this. If aggregate demand shifts to the left, we move to the right on the short run Phillips curve. Okay, hold that thought. Then we'll go set up the same scenario again, right? Now there's an increase in the cost of energy. Increase in cost of energy, we now have point B. All right. Now, how do I put point B on this graph? Because I have higher prices and higher unemployment. If I move along this graph, I'm either getting one going down and one going up. So I can't put it on this graph, so what I will need to do is shift the graph, right? Shift a new curve. And that would be point B. All right, so leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve causes a rightward shift of the short run Phillips curve. Aggregate demand is a movement along the curve. Aggregate supply causes shifts of the curve. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand are both shifting, and short run Phillips curve is either moving along or shifting. Now let's look at what if there's an increase in technology or ability to produce? Well, that's going to cause our long run aggregate supply curve to change. All right? So we have long run Phillips curve, which is horizontal. It's not influenced by inflation or unemployment. Okay? We put it at the 4% rate. Now, the long run aggregate supply curve is also at full employment. So if there's new technology, we're going to get a rightward shift of the long run aggregate supply curve, which means we're going to get a leftward shift, right? We get a leftward shift of the long run Phillips curve, all right? Because we're at a higher point. All right, next one real quick. All right, here we have both models where they need to be, right? So we're in full employment equilibrium on the left, which means we're at equilibrium on the long run Phillips curve and short run Phillips curve. They intersect each other at the same point, right? And then from there, they'll move based on what happens to AD and AS. So any Phillips curve question, you have to go back to AD and AS. All right, just to show you some numbers with the Phillips curve. This was the 50s and 60s, and these are actual numbers. And you look at it, you can say, you say, it's pretty damn close to being exactly what they said the Phillips curve was. There was that trade-off. There's a couple of spots, but no big outliers. But here's what happened, is you had the 70s, right? Late 60s, early 70s, and 80. You end up having a all over the place. But if you look at these, they're really shifts of the curve. Why? Because we had stagflation. That's an aggregate supply curve. Shifting to the left, which would shift this to the right. Okay, so the model still holds. You just got to remember that if it's supply, you're shifting the curve. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you when I see you.